here we are in Swindon. We've come down today for Brooklands Members TV to spend some wonderful time with Alan Smith, and I'll introduce Alan to you momentarily. But Alan and I have something very, very special in common. We're both extremely privileged to have flown Concorde, the world's only successful supersonic airliner. Alan flew it as a test pilot at the beginning of Concorde's life, and I flew it as an ordinary British Airways pilot towards the end of Concorde's time in commercial service. But the one thing we've got in common is that privilege, that enormous privilege to have been Concorde pilots.
Absolutely.
So, Alan, thank you so much for welcoming us to your home this morning.
It's lovely to have you.
Swindon. And you've made us so welcome already. We haven't even started
My
yet.
dear chap.
But thanks very much. I read that amazing article that you wrote a few years ago.
The one to celebrate 50 years.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
And
because I've had the privilege of two in aeroplane. One was focused on Delta Golf, the Brooklands aeroplane. That was to celebrate its arrival in '74, i.e., so that was last year,
yes.
this article.
Yeah,
That's focused on Delta Golf. And then you're talking about the original one celebrating 50 years.
And we've been fascinated by your career, particularly the time, of course, flying Concorde and flying Delta Golf.
Yes.
So at Brooklands, I help out on the current flight simulator.
Lovely.
That I know you flew way back when it first started. And you'll know, of course, that it's now been rebuilt.
Well, it's quite different.
And it's incredible.
But it's lovely to see.
Yeah.
You know, particularly the visual. Of course, the original visual was very much an acquired taste.
Yeah.
Well, it was so bloody poor. We had to teach guys on the aeroplane how to land the aeroplane because you couldn't do that in the simulator.
No, that's right. Well, we'll come on to that. In fact, I'm at Brooklands tomorrow, flying that very simulator that you first flew when it was introduced in 1976. But let's go back. Now, I know that you started flying in 1948, so by the time you joined BAC in 1968, you had already been flying 20 years.
Absolutely.
So just give me literally 2 minutes on what you flew
Fine.
in that 20 years
well,
before.
I'll give you a little bullet. First of all, a cadet. Started at 15, got lucky, did some gliding. A couple of years later, after a flight in a Lancaster, would you believe? How about that? Fair. That's why that picture's up there. I got a flying scholarship, and that got me a PPL. So by 17, I got a pilot's license, PPL. The selection procedure for the flying scholarship is very close to that for the RAF. So in a sense, in those days, if you'd got a flying scholarship, you got your foot in the door to join the Air Force. I was an apprentice plumber in Newcastle, working in factories and shipyards, etc. And it was no contest whatsoever once I got airborne. That was it. I was going to fly away from Newcastle, not go in a ship. And so I joined the Air Force as soon as I could. Which was 18, because I didn't think my father would allow me to go earlier, and he could stop me before 18 in those days. So I waited till I was 18, and I was off. Right. I went through classic training, apprentice, Harvard. I wanted to fly the Hastings, 4 big props. Needless to say, I ended up on jets, which I didn't want to fly. None of us wanted to fly. None of them. We ended up on night fighters, which we thought was the worst option possible. Nevertheless, that's what I did. Meteor Squadron in Germany, bent a couple, got lucky, lived. Venoms, again, got lucky, managed to survive Venoms. Not everybody did. Killed quite a lot of lugs, which makes me a bit anti-de Havilland. And... But I was always going to leave the Air Force. I always wanted to be an airline pilot. So when they offered me a permanent commission, I thanked the boss very much and said, no, thank you, I'm off. So after almost a year's studying, I aimed for the highest license at the time, which is the ALTP. There was no point in having a flight nav. ALTP, and that took me quite some time, several months. On the dole, it's £6 a week with rent 8.5 guineas in Ealing. And at the end of it, there was no job, because jobs in those days were very seasonal, very, very seasonal indeed. So I got a job driving a van around Ealing for 10 quid a week, which was great fun, the best 3 months of my life for a while. And then I heard Jersey Airlines wanted first officers. So I applied and went down to Jersey. They flew us down there. They gave us a flying test, to see if we could do what we said we could do. And I got a job as a second officer, which is the lowest rank, which you won't see these days, a pilot with one ring on his arm.
That's right.
You don't see that anymore. You start with half a dozen up their arm, male or female. But Jersey Airlines was a wonderful airline to fly for. I've flown with 35 airlines and outfits and air forces in my career, globally. And Jersey Airlines was a star.
And what aircraft type did you go on?
Well, I started at DC-3, which was my dream. I mean, a dream machine, a DC-3 for me, a real pilot's aeroplane. And within a few months, because of, I suppose, my ability and because of my license, I was earmarked for a quick promotion. So I became a junior captain on the Heron. So I did 18 months on the Heron. Then I got my DC-3 command, which was all I ever wanted. And I knocked up 3,000 hours on the DC-3 because they worked our backs off at Jersey Airlines. The first year at Jersey Airlines, I did 920 hours. And in the 8 years in the Air Force, I only did 1,500. Yeah. There's the difference. Yeah. But it was a wonderful apprenticeship. Because it's one thing to be able to fly an aeroplane, but you've got to do the job with the aeroplane.
Yeah.
And to be a first officer, you know, you've got to work at it. You've got not to covet the captain's job for a start. You've got to help him, not covet him, and learn. And I had a lot to learn, quite different from being in the Air Force. And it was a good apprenticeship for me.
Very much so. I've been training for a long time in the airlines. And,
yes.
And I've trained a lot of people who've come out of the military into the civilian world. And it is a big transition.
It is.
Yeah. And so how did you go from Jersey Airlines to becoming a test pilot?
Well, Jersey Airlines, we bought the Dart Herald, which was a nice aeroplane. The Voss bought 6, but unfortunately it ran out of cash. So we were bought by British United, which is the British Commonwealth Shipping Company, basically, and we were bought by British United. Now, the good thing about that was we had to stiffen up a bit professionally, and aircraft-wise, we actually got some of their Viscounts. So I was lucky enough to get 500 hours on a Viscount, right up, starting with the 7 Series and then ending on the 833s, which were absolutely superb. I loved the Viscount very much. And then we ran into industrial trouble because the boss of the owner of Lord Kaiser decided that union busting, if I'm going...
That's right, go on.
Union busting was something he was going to do. So he got rid of Freddie Laker, who was a super MD, and he hired a charming gentleman called Alan Bristow. And Alan Bristow's job was to break the unions in British United, which he did. He did. He called a meeting in the hangar. He stood on a soapbox and he said, "My name's Alan Bristow. I'm your boss, and you now work for me. I do not recognize trade unions." By then we were Balfour in Jersey. Jersey was an affiliated company or associated company. So having broken British United, which he did, British Airways pilots were on picket duty at Gatwick at the time. You could write a book about it. It was memorable. 32 people resisted Bristow and left. 32, including one charming lady who became a Comet the first lady Comet captain, Yvonne Pope. Yvonne Siddays when she married, delightful woman. And having done that, he then turned his attention to the associated companies. So he focused on Jersey. And the brief was, I'm going to take the Viscounts away. I'm going to sell some of your aeroplanes. You're going from 60 pilots down to 30, and there is no compensation for the 30 I'm going to make redundant, because redundancy rules did not apply in Jersey. So the 30 that were going to get the boot, they weren't going to get a penny. So to cut a short story, we went on strike. He came down to see us. He called a meeting. He said, "You go on strike, I'll shut down the company." We went on strike. He shut down the company. Oh, just like that.
Just like
in one day, a bit like Trump, we changed from BUCIA, British United Cities and Islands Airlines, to BIA. But by then, of course, I'd gone. I mean,
that was the end of your...
I mean, once they took me off a Viscount and put me back on the Herald, and I'm in my early 30s, I thought, no. So I'm out of here. So I started looking for a job.
Right.
I looked globally. And there was nothing at that time, 1968 spring, nothing. No, I wrote 70-odd letters. I've bought a typewriter. I typed 70-odd letters. Carbon paper, Tipex, you name it. And I got one maybe, come and see us. That was from Luton, Auxerre. I didn't fancy Luton, but then, and I was getting a bit desperate then, you know, and I remembered, and literally remembered, a little advertisement, 3 or 4 lines in flight, because in those days, I don't know what they do these days, but in those days, we turned to the back pages in flight and checked the jobs.
I did the same.
I was SOP, and then we read the magazine if we got the time. Then it got too high-tech for me, I couldn't read it, I changed to aeroplane. Anyway, I remember seeing a little advert from British Aircraft Corporation. VAC 111 training pilots wanted a fly chief test pilot, Wisley Airfield. Right?
Wisley Airfield, right.
Wisley, the flight test centre for Brooklands.
Yeah, yeah.
So I thought, well, I am not a VAC 111 pilot, but it was the right progression for me at that time in my early 30s to go Herald Viscount 111 VC10, because British United had VC10s, and that's what I'd got my eyes on eventually.
Yeah. And the 111s and the VC10s all built at Weybridge, of course, which is now
most of
Brooklands,
including Concorde.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes, absolutely.
So you joined by 1968. You joined the flight test
at Wisley.
At Wisley, the flight test team, right?
Yeah, I joined.
So Concorde now at that stage hasn't flown, but it's being built and being developed.
Yes,
it hasn't flown yet, and part of it was being built just down the road at Weybridge by then. So how aware were you of Concorde?
Didn't feature on my spectrum whatsoever.
Right.
If I was focused on the 111, I had to become a 111 TRE, eventually IRE, CEA approval. I had lots of hurdles to go through.
Yeah, IRE, I'll just interject there with the IRE is Instrument Rating Examiner and TRE is Type Rating Examiner.
Indeed.
So you're an examiner for pilots.
I had to be an examiner because the ethos of 111 purchase was if you bought a 111, the British Aircraft Corporation pilots went with the aircraft. Contractually, it couldn't fly without a VAC pilot being on board until we as a team approved the pilots, and then they could go without us. And that was contractual.
Okay.
And testing at times, but it was.
Literally, yeah.
Basically, yes, literally. Basically, we would go with the aeroplane, deliver it to wherever. Fiji was the farthest I delivered to. That was 5-day flight on a 111 to Fiji. But wonderful. And you stayed there typically for 2 or 3 months, and then you left. Yeah. And that was it. My Concorde interest would be just the same as anybody in the public, picking it up in a newspaper or a magazine. I wasn't interested at all. The corridor in Wisley, which were lots of little offices and little doors, on each door had a window on, and the window was covered with a file cover, so the guys in the office could go to sleep after lunch without being seen from the corridor, because the basic things in British Aircraft Corporation are where you park your car, where you eat your lunch. Flying was absolutely secondary, believe you me. But the point I'm trying to make is that on that corridor, on those windows, were things like 211, 311, X11. You know, what went on behind those doors, I don't know, because I was as much a fish out of water then as I was when I came out of the Air Force and went into a DC-3 as a first officer.
Yeah.
It's challenging to adapt to the industry, just as challenging as it is to go other ways. And it was very tricky.
Yeah, I flew over Wisley just a few days ago, and it's still there, but only just. It's shortly going to become.
It was lovely. It was pastoral. It was lovely.
A lot of history there.
And of course, I flew out of Brooklands as well, so I am a Brooklands pilot. After all, HQ was at Brooklands.
Yeah,
you know, the office was there, the pensions were there, the money was there.
The money was there. And I often, when I do my talks, I explain how the first meetings between Britain and France to discuss this new supersonic airliner
indeed.
took place in those headquarters at Weybridge.
At Weybridge, indeed.
Headquarters.
Indeed.
And then they went on to sign the treaty between the two governments in November 1962. So, So then, where were you when Concorde first flew on the 2nd of March, 1969?
I was probably on my way to Palmer out of Luton in a 111.
In a 111.
You're talking about the French one. March. March 69. I was not aware hyper-aware.
Right, it wasn't.
I wasn't flying my 111 thinking, oh, Mr. Trubshaw, who after he gave me it took me about 3 or 4 interviews to get into VAC.
Yeah, okay.
Because the guys to interview me were never there.
Right.
You know, so I had to go and be interviewed by whoever was there, a deputy, and then he'd say, oh, I'd like you to come back and see. And, you know, it took quite a few months before I could get into VAC.
Right, and so you had to have an interview ultimately with Brian Trubshaw.
I had an interview with Brian Trubshaw, which was memorable. I was, and you see, unbeknown to me, he was at a place called Fairford. He was setting up the offices, and he was at Filton. I didn't know that. I knew nothing of those places. I didn't know where the hell Swindon was. You know, I mean, it was over the curvature of the earth.
So despite knowing nothing by the sounds of it, you got through this interview and got a job on.
I did. Well, I was honest with Trub, you see, because I'd just been on strike. And, I mean, I was quite you know, I'm skipping a bit, but I mean, I took VAC to court 3 times.
Oh, well, we won't go there. But
no,
exactly. Did you know? How did he strike you when you first had that interview with Trubshaw?
Oh, he's very relaxed and nice.
Yeah, he was.
He was, and I said to him, "Look, I know I'm on strike, and that's why I'm leaving Jersey."
Right.
Right.
So you were honest as well.
Because Jersey was still active. It was VU. It was still VU. CIA was still flying.
Yeah.
And I jumped before I was pushed.
Yeah. Okay.
I wasn't going to wait till I was sighted. In fact, I think I was the only pilot to resign.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because 2 months after I left, the airline folded.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
So I knew that there were 30 guys in Jersey who were going to be looking for a job. And I didn't want to be at the end of the queue.
No, so you saw,
in fact, I didn't
the
actually have to leave.
Yeah.
I could have stayed as the most junior captain or the most senior first officer and fly a Herald. That wasn't attractive to me.
Not if you were in your 30s.
No.
So by now, so you've joined the team at Wisley.
At Wisley,
and
yes.
Wisley closed in 1972.
Yes, it did indeed. Memorable.
So, very sad. But there's so much history at Weybridge, of course, and there is now in Brooklands. So you've now joined the team. And how did you get from there onto the Concorde team?
Well, by luck and by God.
Yeah, same here.
Not by ability. What happened was they closed Wisley. So, I remember them bricking the corridor up. They put bricks onto half the size of the building to reduce the rates. Mm. And I was going through the process of getting ready to go to Fiji. So, you know, you do a lot of office work in the industry as a pilot. I mean, you work 9 to 5, 5 days a week, whether you're flying or not. It's quite different from anything else I've ever done, and I enjoyed it. So they closed Wisley, and 4 pilots. Some people went to a place called Fairford. Mm. I had seen Fairford because, as well as flying the 111, I also flew the Heron and I also flew the Beagle. I flew anything I could get my hands on.
Yeah.
Didn't restrict myself to a 111. So I knew of this place called Fairford, and by then I knew there was a Concorde there. And after all, I've been there 4 years.
Yeah.
Nearly. And 4 of us were sent to a place called Brooklands. Fine, we knew Brooklands. And they made Barnes Wallis redundant at, I think, 83 or 84. So they moved 4 of us into Barnes Wallis's office.
Oh, I'm having lunch in there tomorrow.
Delightful. Fitted carpet, a tiled fireplace in the corner, mantelpiece. There's an amusing story here, I tell you. Music story, and they put 4 of us in there, and we got on with our paperwork. I'm going to Fiji in a couple of months' time. You know, don't bore me about any. Concorde didn't feature, so all of a sudden, let me tell you about the sherry. Now, one of the important things about being in the industry are where you park your car, very important, and where you eat your lunch. That is vital, because that's the quality of the day. Yeah. And depending on your rank, if I can use that word, that's where you ate and that's what you drank. So if you're a director, you are in your own director's mess with hard spirits, sherries, beers, soft drinks. If you're aircrew or senior management, you didn't get the hard spirits, but you got the sherries and the beers and the ciders and that. So aircrew, we had our aircrew mess at Wisley, and it was delightful. Bird's eye maple furniture, silver service, your own napkin rings, absolutely delightful. And they closed it. So they sent us to Brooklands. So we are there in Barnes Wallis's office, and there's a problem. And the problem is there is not a room in the management mess equivalent to our rank to accommodate us. It's full.
Yeah.
Executives. Yeah. So we've got to eat at one level lower than is our rank. And we won't get any sherry. Bloody hell. So the delightful lady manageress, whose name I forget, but quite nice lady, as they all were eventually, she said, now look, I will slip you a few bottles. So in those days, we wore BEA uniforms, and the raincoat had large pockets, and you could get 3 bottles of wine in a pocket. So we would go for lunch, 12 o'clock, we would go for lunch, and she would slip us some bottles. So once we'd got the bottles, they would go on Barnes Wallis's mantelpiece, and in our office, when it got to a certain time, let's say we were going to eat at 12:30, when it came up to 12, one of us would get up and say, anybody for a drink? And we would have our sherry in Barnes Wallis' office, and we would take the empties back to the mess, slip to the manageress, she would replace them in our raincoat, and this is what we did. Amazing. Yeah. Anyway, out of the blue, we got an invitation to come to Fairford, which was very nice. Right. So 4 of us drove to Fairford. 2 of us were fired within 5 minutes of getting out of our car, including me, and the other 2, the nicer 2, the older 2, beloved by all, including me, beloved by all, lovely guys. They were kept on. And we were sent home. Ralphie Conn, who ended up as the CA inspector on the Jumbo.
Ralph,
Ralph, great guy.
South African guy.
Well, great guy. Super guy. Ralph, next desk to me in Barnes Wallis's office. They gave us the boot. So we came back from Fairford to Brooklands. Ralph walked up to his desk, took his files out of his desk, put them in his briefcase and said, see ya, and walked out. I saw him 2 or 3 years later. I was furious. I was going to Fiji, damn it. I wasn't going to leave. I was going to work my 3 months' notice.
Right, but now you were needed to go... carry on.
I wasn't. No, I wasn't. I'd got the boot. So I was going to work my 3 months' notice because I needed that 3 months to find out where I was going. Ralph had made his mind up. He was off. He joined East Midlands eventually on the 707.
Right.
I sat down. I had a huge imperial typewriter on my desk at Barnes Wallis, and I typed 2 letters. I typed one to the, I forget his name now, but the minister in charge of aircraft production, Wilkinson, I think his name, and one to the guy who just fired me, John Cochrane, very angry at having to do it he was, actually invited us to stay for lunch. We told him what he could do with that. I wrote 2 letters and posted them. I got no reply from the government, of course, and the essence of my letter was, how can you work and test and produce a thing like Concorde and try and sell it here and fire your youngest training pilots? That's ridiculous, because the guys he kept on were in their 50s.
And so John Cochrane replied, by the sounds of it. And tell me,
I got 2 or 3 days later, I got a phone call from John Cochrane, who I basically didn't know because he was aloof and distant from me at Wisley. He was VC-10 testing, and I'm grovelling around trying to get on a 111. I mean, we were poles apart. And I hadn't flown with him, certainly. Anyway, John Cochrane rang me up and he said, I said, yeah. He said, thanks for your letter. I thought, that was nice. He said, that's given me something to work on. He said, no, I can't say anything. He said, but please don't do anything. Stay at your desk. Things are happening. Please. I said, fine. Thanks very much. That's what I wanted to do anyway. So he rang me again a few days later and said, right, he said, forget your redundancy, go to Fiji, we'll see you when you come back.
Really?
Yeah, and what had happened was, at Fairford was a Wisley test pilot, well-known, called Lou Roberts, who was an ex-Bristol Britannia man, VC-10 testing. I had been with him on my jet conversion at Middleton St George in 52. In fact, I'd been in the next hut at Cranwell with him in 51, so I knew Lou Roberts. Now, Lou Roberts, not to denigrate him, was very much a Jack the Lad, privately. He was always into trouble with women, with money, and he was always selling cameras and cars. And what had happened was, when they'd made me redundant, and Ralph, and 1 or 2 others, Lou had gone to the boss and said, you didn't make me redundant. And they said, well, no, you're at Fairford. I don't know whether he ever flew Concorde, to be honest, because it was very difficult to get in the aeroplane. So, to cut a long story short, they gave Lou Roberts my redundancy, which gave him the money, and they gave me Lou Roberts' position.
Right.
And I buggered off to Fiji.
With the 111.
Came back, then they didn't know what to do with me, so they seconded me to Court Line at Luton for a few months, kept me flying, and at Christmas, I was invited to go to Fairford.
Right, and that's when you joined the Concorde team.
Joined the Concorde team early 73. Early 73. Shuttled off to Singapore on the 111 straight away.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting in what you might call an office, and like a duck out of water. Not, absolutely a spare prick.
Yeah. And then, so I remember you said you went down to Toulouse in April 73, and there was a fairly basic Concorde simulator down there.
They were doing, at that time, off study groups. So there were two very able guys, one an ex-flight sergeant, Navrad, he'd been on my squadron. In fact, he'd replaced me in Germany. Steve, and I forget the other chap's name, and their job was to look at the practical difficulties of in operations, like load sheets, like nav logs.
Right.
And they, using their expertise, they were producing draft documents which we would fly on that basic Concorde simulator. And we were working on various drills, like, for instance, 4-engine flame-out.
Yeah. But it was more of a flight trainer than a full flight.
No, it wasn't a flight trainer.
Okay, it was a proper simulator.
No, it wasn't a flight trainer. That's what was wrong with it. It was not a training simulator. It was very difficult to fly. The visual was rubbish, of course. It was a 60s concept. And, I can't remember myself, but I think Trubshaw had such a handful with it on 2 engines. He sort of walked away from it and said, "That's it, I'm not getting on that thing again." Now, that may or may not be true, but it could well be true, because he certainly didn't overindulge himself on simulators, I can tell you that.
But the aeroplane, Concorde itself, has been flying for 4 years now in a test regime.
It had indeed.
We're now into 73.
It had indeed.
So Concorde was the most tested aeroplane.
It was. It went on to 78.
Yeah, absolutely.
I flew it in 78 on test.
So I want to get to that now. So it first flew in 69. 2nd of March 69 in France, 9th of April in the UK.
Yes.
And then 7 years later, before it went into commercial service, on the 21st of January 1976.
Yes.
But as you rightly said, the testing was still going on until 78.
Even after in service.
Yeah, absolutely.
For improvement. Like the intake improvement.
That's it, which I really want to get to. So tell me some of your early flights on Concorde. I've seen Peter Baker's flight manual. All right. I know somebody bought it at an auction, but in there, in Peter's, and it would have been in yours, it spoke about the clothing and the emergency equipment you wore, which I had a British Airways uniform. Tell me about the differences then. So you had these heated and ventilated
Well, let's go back to
suits.
73.
Right. Okay.
I spent most of 73 going up and down the standby runway at Fairford, going through water troughs and not flying.
Right.
Never flew.
Right.
I didn't fly until December 73. I had my first flight on the jump seat, I think, watching Trubshaw and Peter Marsh.
Yeah.
But you were airborne in it. And the same week, I checked out on the Canberra, because with my guile, Concorde was difficult to fly. It was difficult to fly, not because of the aeroplane, which was superb, but because you couldn't get on the damn thing. I mean, if you were 11 out of 11 guys, I mean, you're the T-boy anyway, and you're waiting for the crumbs off the table. Trubshaw did half the testing. Half.
Yeah.
I don't have a beef about that. He had the responsibility. So the other 10 of us were scrabbling for the other half.
Yeah.
And, of course, so I thought to myself in 73, if I can get in that Canberra, at least I'll get on the flying board. Because the drill was at 5 o'clock, on a day, John Cochrane would come out of his office into his annex, and he'd write the next day's programme up on the board.
Yeah.
And you, before you went home at 5 o'clock, would have a quick peek to see if by any chance your name was on there. Well, of course, it wasn't.
Okay.
It wasn't for several reasons. So I said to John, can I fly the Canberra? And he said, oh, well, what do you want to do? I said, well, I want to get airborne. I want to fly, for God's sake. So he said, well, you've flown in the air. I said, yes, I have. Meteor, Venom, all right. He said, you'll have to become an MOD test pilot. I said, fine. So I went through all those hoops, which is great. Well, it wasn't great. It was interesting, almost pleasant on occasion. But you don't want to know about that. But in late 73, December 73, I got my first flight on at 002 with Mr. Trubshaw.
Right.
And then in 74, Delta Golf arrived.
Right.
And things changed because we now got 3 Concordes.
3 Concordes,
now,
all based at Fairfield.
Yes, all of it. Now, the point I've just slightly missed was safety equipment. You couldn't fly on 002 or Delta November, the second one, which is at Duxford.
Yeah.
You couldn't fly on that unless you had the safety equipment.
Right.
And if the safety equipment didn't fit you, you couldn't fly.
Yeah. Can you describe some of that equipment to me? And I've seen it.
Indeed. Well, basically, you had a vac parachute.
A parachute as a
Oh, yeah, you
pilot,
had a vac parachute because there were 2 escape slides in 002 and Delta November.
Yeah.
One just by the main entrance and one aft, which you could explosively detonate from the cockpit, right? And from once you'd made the decision to do that, you detonated the escape hatch, and you used emergency oxygen, not your main oxygen, to get from your seat in the cockpit to that hatch. And once you got to that hatch, there's a tube that comes from the roof down to the floor, and you anchored it on yourself onto that tube with a toggle switch, and you fell down the hole, very roughly a 2-foot square hole. I don't know whether you've seen it. Well, you can see it at 002 at Yeovil.
Yeovil, it's on that one, right?
I can show you a picture of it. You can get it online.
Yeah.
And you fell out of there, and you fell to 10,000 feet, free fall, on your emergency oxygen, until a barometric fuse opened your parachute. And then you fell into the channel, and your automatic signal sent a message up to God, and he came in a helicopter and he took you back to mess for lunch. That was the drill. Now, just getting in and out of Concorde with a parachute and a dinghy, well, you'd have a hernia.
Yeah.
But unless you could fit the equipment, you see, what you did was you wore a skeletal harness, which you could put on at any time. And then when you sat down, your equipment was clipped onto that harness.
By then you were already in your pilot's seat.
You're in your seat. Otherwise, you wouldn't get in.
Yeah,
I mean, how you got out.
Yeah.
And bearing in mind, I mean, the interesting thing was, if you blasted that hatch at 50 to 60,000 feet, a blast shield first went out into the slipstream, and it was reckoned by those who knew what they were talking about that that blast shield would create a vacuum in the cabin. Apart from the fact you're depressurized, that would create a vacuum, and your cabin altitude would be about 75,000 feet. Well, it's hypothetical. I mean, you wouldn't stand a chance in hell. Only in a very controlled evacuation would you stand. Now, before one poo-poos that, and I include this in my talk, but you don't do it in your talk for obvious reasons, one must remember Jock Bryce blasting out of the Valiant and living, and his co-pilot dying when he hit the fin, and also the second prototype Britannia, which was put down in the mud 3 miles short of the end of the runway. Because if they'd had parachutes, they might have jumped.
Right.
Jumped because he had an ejector seat. The Britannia people stayed with it, and they went in the mud 3 miles short of the runway.
Yeah.
Because that was Bill Pegg's decision, and I don't argue with Bill Pegg.
So that's why they installed all this in the test, in the prototype Concorde.
Incidentally, as an aside, that's why we retrofitted it to the VC-10 tankers. When the VC-10s came to Filton to be refurbished, we fitted an escape hatch.
Even in those days?
Yes,
wow,
and I've got.
And these suits could be plugged in to the air conditioning system of the aeroplane, wouldn't they? They could be heated or cooled as appropriate.
Yes, because in the beginning of Concorde there were 5 pilots. And there were 5 sets of safety equipment, because you're talking about a safety equipment to a higher degree than what I was talking about, and I never flew in. It was almost astronaut, pressure breathing, which you've hinted at, and a more pressurized mask. Now, there were only 5 kits because they cost a fortune. and they fitted 5 blokes. And the flight engineers, so there'd be more than 5. But the point I'm making is, because of money, budget, etc., there were only so many kits, and if that didn't fit you, you couldn't fly. By the time I got onto it, if you like, the second grade, the harness still had to fit you, the bone dome still had to fit you, the mask still had to fit you, otherwise you didn't get on it. And indeed, some of my colleagues, training pilot colleagues, older than me, more corpulent than me, didn't get on it until eventually it became a shirt sleeve aeroplane. I mean, Delta Golf was a shirt sleeve aeroplane.
Yeah, but leading up to that, you had to wear one of these helmets. Is in the display cabinet on board Delta Golf at Brooklands.
And my fly suit's hanging alongside it.
Oh, is it really? That's yours. I'll have a look tomorrow.
Trump's kit's there, and Al's fly suit's hanging in the glass case.
Right, I'm in there tomorrow.
And it's just an ordinary RAF fly suit.
Nothing fantastic as well. Yeah. So tell me a little bit about the water ingestion trials.
Right.
That was 1973 as well.
That was, well, it went on for years.
Yeah, it did.
It's not only, it started on 002, and what the French were doing, I don't know.
So for the layman, why do we have to test? What are we testing? The ingestion of water?
We're testing to see that the water spray from the undercarriage is or is not ingested into the engines, and if it's ingested into the engines, does it cause damage? And the answer is yes, it is ingested into the engines, and yes, it will damage the engines.
Right, this is quite important. So how do we carry out these tests and where?
Well, we would use what I call the standby runway at Fairford. It's a bit like the standby runway at Gatwick. It's a taxiway originally, but you know and everybody else knows that in extremis you could put yourself down on that. And Fairford, in a sense, was the same. It's a parallel taxiway of almost equal proportions to the runway, but it's not a runway. Anyway, flight test bonded some rubber guttering on that taxiway. It's called a taxiway. Filled it with up to 3 inches of water, and we would park ourselves at the beginning of that and full power, and we would drive ourselves through that from 30 knots up to 120. And the engines would surge, and they did surge. And a surge is not like a verb. A surge is a Welsh. You know it. And certainly in flight you know it. And I've done... in fact, I did engine surges more than anything else.
So we'll come to the airborne surges later. Shortly. That's a different subject.
It is.
So
on the ground...
We had to make sure...
Yes.
That this water was not going into the engine, so we could take off on very wet runways.
Absolutely.
In commercial service.
So they designed a spray bar.
With a spray bar,
which you can see on the undercarriage. It's a sort of 3-foot chunk of metal and composite material, an ugly damn thing, clamped to the undercarriage, something slightly similar on the nose wheels. It suppresses the spray. The engines do not ingest water.
Absolutely, and they stayed on the aeroplane until it was retired in 2003.
Once you've done that on 002, Delta November being different, and Delta Golf being different, of course, it had to be done on other aeroplanes as well, because the engine changed.
Yes.
There were Olympus, they weren't the same engines.
No, and the intakes evolved.
So ground surging went on for quite some time as well, and in-flight surging went on to 78.
Yes, and did the water deflectors... They didn't change design though, did they?
Not that I'm aware of.
They stayed pretty much throughout the whole aeroplane service. I think. Yeah, that's right. Yeah. So that was a vital part of the testing program that you were involved in. That water.
Certainly, I did a lot of that because you see, it's crumbs off the table. I mean, the ethos at Fairford was quite simple. Flight test in their infinite wisdom was a wonderful flight test run by Bob McKinley, who was a superb guy.
Yeah.
You know, Bob McKinley and Trubshaw stood shoulder to shoulder, but McKinley was a giant.
Okay.
A giant, McKinley was.
So at this stage, you haven't got airborne in Concorde, but so that you first flew...
down the runway. I'm flying on 111.
Yeah. But then you first flew in Concorde in just before Christmas 1973.
December 73.
With Peter Baker. And
yes,
Peter,
my dear friend, and he is a dear friend, Peter Baker.
I met Peter.
Been in this house several times.
Has he really?
Oh yes.
Yeah, he came to Brooklands. We had a reunion there.
Yes.
That my daughter organised.
An officer and a gentleman.
Yeah, and he really was a lovely, lovely man.
Yep.
And by the time he came to Brooklands for that reunion, sadly he had dementia.
Ah, was he?
But Jane, my daughter, told me in fact I was there.
Yes.
So he had dementia. But Jen said, I got him into the flight deck of Delta Gulf, and he came alive.
Did he really?
She said it was absolutely fantastic.
Yes.
He knew what everything did.
Oh, he did. Well, he was brains.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, he stood apart from the others.
Yeah, yeah.
Mind he wasn't perfect.
No, well, none of us were. But
Well, none of us are.
So what was that flight? How do you remember that first flight with Peter?
I don't.
You don't. But it was a going off, and it was part of the test regime.
Yeah.
And it was your first time flying.
It was.
With
You see,
Peter.
I don't have my logbooks anymore.
No.
And I can't remember. Of course, it was memorable. I can't tell you what we did or
But
whatever.
it was part of the. You were now flying.
We
Concorde.
were now testing all sorts of things. Yes. I remember an engine failure. I think with Vega and dumping 40-ton over the southwest approaches and going back, that sort of thing. And I did a few Casablanca tours and also Vega and
I think you mentioned I wanted to get to Casablanca.
Yes.
Because a lot of testing was done in Casablanca.
Yes.
Why?
Well. Again, it's all about engine surging in flight. Now, that started out of Tangier. The Delta November, the second British Concorde, would position to Tangier, and they would fly out of Tangier and deliberately surge engines. Now, why Tangier? Tangier eventually was superseded by Casablanca. It is a fact not known by everybody that if cold upper air is over the equator.
Yeah.
So you want cold air to get the power and the efficiency out of the engine. So the aircraft was positioned to Tangier, nothing to do with me, except when the tests were finished, the surge tests were finished, all the recording was done on tapes. And the tapes were put in a Canberra and flown back to Fairford for analysis. And I would fly the Canberra along with other people. So my foresight, if you like, or luck in getting on the Canberra got me with the Concorde team in Tangier, right? So if you're there eating at the boss's table and enjoying their talk, you know, I mean, you don't have to be too bright to work it out. And if they don't like you, you're dead. And if they like you, you're not. It's as simple as that.
One thing I wanted to just really highlight on here, we're in with this part of the world because the upper air temperatures, we're going to be flying Concorde at 60,000 feet, it's colder.
Cold. Minus 83 was the coldest I saw.
I've spoken to somebody who's seen minus 94.
I dare say.
Minus 83.
Well, that's what you're looking for.
Yeah, and therefore you've got a great temperature differential.
Yes.
Because flying at Mach 2, the temperature of the aeroplane would get up to a maximum of 127, and you saw
about 118 one day and minus 83 outside in wearing shirt sleeves in Delta Gulf.
That's why you wanted to see that large temperature range to make sure the engines could cope with that. Those cold air temperatures, but hot and with a hot aeroplane.
And of course, there are other benefits as well out of Tangier and Casablanca. Is low air traffic, and no boom problem. So you were supersonic within 9 minutes of getting airborne, and you'd turn and beam the Canaries and the African coast, and you'd go straight up to cruise 50,000 feet. The flight engineer would then take manual control of an intake, one of the four, and he would inch it until it went critical, i.e. a boom would enter the intake and the engine would surge. That was now a point on a graph. It's a height, speed, temperature, weight point on a graph for the digital program, eventually, which would control the intakes automatically. And to me, and lay speak, that is the single most successful thing in Concorde.
Absolutely,
because it hasn't been emulated in a lot of other aeroplanes,
and they still can't do it now.
Exactly.
And we know that the Russians stole the plans for the intakes and all that.
Indeed,
kind of stuff.
we do. Indeed.
And so when I do my talks about Concorde, I highlight the fact that the computers that controlled these intakes, these ramps, were the first digital computers to be used in aviation. But next to the lane controllers, there are 4 switches. I say they're labelled up and down. It's actually open and shut, I think. And I always say that if the flight engineer in airline service ever had to do that manually, he'd probably have to put his T down. But they worked so well by the time I was flying Concorde because of the work you did and your team in Tangier and Casablanca in the 1970s. Phenomenal, absolutely phenomenal. So the engineer would literally inch the ramp
until the engine surged. Now, when it surged, because the engines are co-located, right, the aircraft would yaw, and that would sometimes trigger off a surge in the other engine in the nacelle. That was obviously, it could be coped with. I mean, the air flight engineer would cope with it. and the guy flying the aeroplane, which generally wasn't me. I'm a co-captain. I'm sitting there to take it home when he's finished, basically.
Yeah.
And if it wasn't your day, and all four let loose, believe you me, I'm not exaggerating, you would be frightened.
Yeah.
It was literally terrifying. You were bouncing around like nobody's business at Mach 2, wondering, God, how is this going to end?
Yeah.
And I mean, the French broke one doing it. They literally broke the engine, literally. Intake blew out, buggered the engine, whatever. So you knew that, and you were hoping that, it wasn't going to happen to you, and it didn't.
Yeah.
We did. I can't remember, honestly, any problem in the air after engine surge. Now, once it got on the ground and the strain gauges were looked at and the engineers got in there and looked at, they may have found things that we as pilots I was a pilot, wouldn't know about.
No. But, this was a vital part of the aeroplane's
certificate. Absolutely vital.
Yeah. And that testing went on after the aeroplane entered service in '76. The testing went on
because they find the lip.
As I was just going to come to the thin lip modification.
It's called the thin lip intake.
Yeah. So Ian Kirby, who's a volunteer at Brooklands, former flight engineer, involved in intake development work. He's mentioned to me the thin lip modification.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, I know nothing about it, except I did the testing. But it produced a performance benefit. I believe 1.5 tons or something like that. Now, 1.5 tons over the fleet over a year is a lot of money.
Yeah.
So that development in 1978...
You're talking of fuel saving.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Weight costs money. God, this power.
Yeah.
Even air conditioning, as you know. It comes down to money. Just again to sidetrack, you were talking about a crew manual, Peter Baker's, and a flight manual, of which you're aware. If you go right back to the concept of the aircraft, the hope always was that they could fly without those manuals.
Okay.
What we were going to have instead of them, I don't know. But that was the hope. But the CAA wouldn't have it.
They haven't it's all on here now. They haven't invented these in those days.
No, they hadn't. They got laptops. Because that's weight. Yeah. And if you multiply that across the fleet, that's money.
Yeah. Well, one of my early jobs in BA was running around putting all the maps and books in the flight deck for the airliners. I know how heavy all those books were.
Indeed, so they are.
It's all on a tablet.
Absolutely.
Nowadays, of course.
Yeah, absolutely.
So this intake testing was absolutely vital.
Yes.
The thin lip modification occurred after the aeroplane went into service.
2 years after.
Yeah, 78. And then after that, as far as I know, surges did still happen. I mean, I didn't join the fleet till 98, but they were quite rare, I think, as time
something would trigger them off. I don't know what, but yes. I, of course, once I trained British Airways, I went off the edge of a cliff. That was me finished.
Yeah, but before we get to that stage, I wanted to talk to you about the visor, the nose and the visor, because when I joined the fleet, I'd turn up in my jacket and my shirt sleeves. I'd climb into this flight deck. I'd have a lovely cup of tea. Soon after takeoff, I'd get served the leftover caviar.
I know.
We'd have a wonderful view out of our glass.
You'd be talking to the Queen Mother. I know. I've heard all. And Joan Collins. I've heard of all of that.
But you flew that aeroplane with a metal visor.
Yes, I did. 002.
Yeah. Tell me about that.
Well, first of all, you knew before you got airborne that that's what you were going to have. So you were preconditioned, and you're a bit naive. You don't quite know what it's going to be like. But basically, when you're airborne at about 250 knots, you lift the nose, you lift the visor, and the most impressive thing is the noise goes away.
Yeah.
In fact, John Cochrane is quoted as saying he thought 4 engines had stopped for the very first time it happened to him. And that makes the initial impression. Then you can't basically see anything. But first and foremost, there's nothing to look for anyway, because you're under radar control from the moment you're airborne. But there was a periscope visor device which would give you... I was going to sound slightly patronising now, but the television sets that your father probably had, the 9-inch Echo blue-grey screens, well, it was a bit like that. And I didn't have one like that, but I can remember them. It was a bit like that. You could see forward, but there wasn't anything to look for anyway. You're flying by instruments.
Yeah.
Obviously,
the
any
metal
airplane.
visor had a small piece of glass in the top.
It does.
Is that where the periscope looked through?
Yes, I believe. And that piece of glass is almost horizontal, of course, therefore it wouldn't generate much kinetic heating. Because the state-of-the-art of glass was behind the state-of-the-art of the aeroplane.
Yeah.
And that showed itself in several ways. Take, for instance, the excuse me, the INS. We had a navigator on the first flights because the pilot and flight engineer INS wasn't developed.
The INS is the inertial navigation system.
Indeed, which eventually was fitted, and then we got rid of the delightful navigator. That visor, it wasn't a problem. And once in my limited flying, we would go around the Bay of Biscay a couple of times. That was basically it. I didn't really go and Concorde anywhere else in 74. And therefore you were under London military control.
Yeah.
So, frankly, until you got into the circuit here under Bryce control...
Then you lower the nose and visor, and it's just like...
Yeah, exactly. It's just like a normal aeroplane. You've got noise and vibration.
So this myth that's evolved over the years that Trubshaw said it'd be a good idea if the pilots could see where they were going, and I don't want a metal visor, is not necessarily the main reason we got rid of the metal visor, is it? I always stress it's because the glass... Pilkington then designed some glass that could cope with the heat and the pressure.
Indeed.
And by the time it went into service...
And I've had a fascinating lecture in Provost by the guy who did that.
Oh, really? Fantastic.
So, the glass visor transformed everything. Yeah. Psychologically as much as anything else, frankly, as you will know.
Absolutely. When I flew the aeroplane, and I've got some great pictures, of course, looking out through the visor.
Sure.
It still cushioned the noise. When my first supersonic flight and the nose and visor came up, and it was still very quiet in the flight deck. It still had the noise cancelling.
Yeah, it's memorable.
I recall also that during that testing time, testing the aeroplane. Then British Airways put the aeroplane in service in 1976, and you were involved in getting some of that nucleus group of pilots.
I was very much so, very much.
I've met Chris Smalley. In fact, I'm going to have lunch with Chris. Next month.
Give him my regards.
I will. Patricia.
There were about 6 of them, if I remember.
Yeah, so there's Chris Smalley, John Eames.
Yes.
Not Harry, but there were about six.
Yeah, there was that delightful. They were all nice. Yeah. They were hand chosen, understandably.
So Chris said when Chris and that group did their training, they didn't have a simulator to train in at that stage because the simulator. We
used the. I'm trying to seek the right words. We used the development simulator. The development simulator at Toulouse. Now, because of the ethos at the time. I and my colleagues were involved. Now, what you've got, if you look at 11 Concorde test pilots, you've got the initial 5, and they're basically test pilots. Think Trubshaw, he's a test pilot. Yeah. He is not a training pilot.
No.
You wouldn't want him as a training pilot, frankly. You might end up with him as a training pilot, but he's a test pilot. Then you've got 6 training pilots who are also test pilots, like co-captains, if you like. Yeah. Now, so somebody like me would fly with a test pilot. Now, when it came to training, particularly British Airways, the nucleus group, we went down to Toulouse. Now, a test pilot did that, but a training pilot like myself went with a test pilot to see that the test pilot, your mate, did the right job for the British Airways guy. Yeah. In other words, he used the right briefing. Yeah. He had the right perspective on the whole flight. And it worked very harmoniously, very much. So it was a mix of a genuine test pilot and a genuine training pilot that trained the nucleus group, who eventually did the route proving.
Yeah, and I understand how that works because it's one thing flying an aeroplane and testing it. It's another thing developing procedures. Yes. Safety and standard operating procedures that you can take into the airline
world. When to keep it shut.
Yeah, and that's how the transition worked.
Absolutely.
Testing, training, and then into everyday operation of it. The failure rate in those initial training courses was up to 30%.
It was 30%, and it was up to 30%. And the British Airways, rightly so in my opinion, criticised, I heard, our training standards on the initial course, not the free course, not the again I'm seeking the words. Not the Chris Morley course, the first production course,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
of which
yeah.
I trained.
Nucleus,
I
not
trained
Nucleus.
Chris Oliver and Leo Butt.
Yeah.
Delightful pair.
I wanted to come on to Chris because Chris was very dear to us all at Brooklands.
Oh, absolutely.
And anybody watching this Brooklands Members TV will know of Chris.
Oh, absolutely.
He wrote the best book ever.
Oh,
didn't he?
absolutely.
The
I
Concorde
still
story.
promoted for him.
Yeah.
When I give talks here, and I say to the audience, in fact, I show a picture of Chris. My Concorde talk. I said, now look, if you want a Concorde book, this is what you get.
You trained Chris Allabard to fly a Concorde.
Can I correct you there?
Yeah.
I sat in the simulator jump seat
himself.
and watched Chris train himself and keep an eye on his captain.
Yeah.
Because as it's well known, Christopher was not only a delightful man, but he was very, very good senior first officer, training first officer.
Yeah.
And in the right simulator with the proper briefings, they just flew in. But I was going to make a point about the money.
Yeah.
Jack Butt was fired basically because they were activating for more money.
Yeah.
And at that time, I was given 10 quid a week.
Yeah.
Concorde differential because there was such a difference between my pay and British Airways pay.
Yeah, that's right. I remember you guys
and
got
when
a pay
British
raise.
Airways took it off me, British Aerospace took it off me, I took them to court, industrial court, and I got my 10 quid a week back.
Well, even when I was on the Concorde fleet towards the end, because we were flying our rate, because we're flying twice as fast as any other aeroplane, was less than the 747 pilots, we had a differential pay so that we weren't losing too much. You didn't go on the Concorde fleet for the money, even in the airline
Of
world.
course you didn't. No rightful pilot would do that.
You were there for the love
you
of
do
the
it for
aircraft.
nothing.
We've only got a few minutes left, but I wanted to talk particularly about Delta Gulf.
Yes.
Now, you used some words in that article when you spoke about...
Simply the best.
There you go, the Tina Turner song that hadn't even been written.
Simply the best.
Why was Delta Gulf simply the best?
Well, I'm talking about... Well, take the aircraft. Visually, it was beautiful. That fining out of the fuselage at the end just completed the picture to me.
Right, so let's get into
the tail cone.
Yeah, what have they done from the prototypes you've been flying with? Tell me about the difference.
Well, the rear fuselage was extended by several feet for, I suppose, aerodynamic reasons and maybe also for fuel trim reasons. I'm not absolutely sure of that. And also, it didn't have a ventral staircase, did it? No. Like the first two did. So they could modify the back behind the pressure bulkhead, and they fined it off. And therefore, visually, I thought the aircraft looked complete.
Yeah, absolutely.
Whereas 002... I suppose you could say it was with a metal visor. It was slightly stunted, but Delta Gulf fitted the bill visually. And when you flew it, like all airplanes at production standard, it's all complete. Yeah. There's no makeup there. You've got the proper INS, you've got the proper kit. You haven't got a parachute strapped to your back or a dinghy on your bum or an oxygen mask on your face. You're in shirt sleeves. And it is the bee's knees. Yeah. It's like a new car, and it smells right, and it looks right, and it flies like a dream.
Yeah.
I mean, a foot, a kilo, or a knot, it's there. Because the controls are superb, and the instrumentation gives you the information you want. The digital readout, for instance. If you want 163 knots, you dial at 163, Absolutely. You get 163.
Absolutely.
Whereas in a 111, you'll get somewhere between 160
plus or minus 10.
And it doesn't really matter. But it matters on Concorde because it's got to be operated to that degree.
Absolutely. And
Precise.
that just proves to me, by the time Delta Gulf flew, she was production standard.
Yes.
She's paved the way for the aeroplanes that then went into service with Air France and British Airways.
Alpha Charlie.
Onwards. And so that just proves to me what a fantastic job you guys did. From I know you weren't there the whole time, but from 1969 all the way through to 76. That's 7 years testing, and it went on while the aircraft was in service. What a fantastic job you guys did, all that team, so that by the time I got my hands on it, much later, it was just an aeroplane. Fantastic aeroplane.
Yeah.
It really was.
You could take it for granted to a degree.
You did quite a lot of flying in Delta Gulf.
Oh, no. When somebody asks me how many hours I got, I say 18,000.
Yeah.
When somebody says, I said, I've got 3,000 on DC-3.
Yeah.
See, I'm trying to impress you now. Yeah. 3,000 hours on DC-3 is not to be sniffed at.
No, it's not.
And by the way, I've got 9,000 on a 111. But I've got 5 years on Concorde.
Yeah.
So I switched to years.
Yeah.
Because the hardest part of Concorde was to get on it.
Yeah.
Because I had to fight 10 other blokes.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean, God damn him. Trub, not my favourite man. One weekend, I was down to flying on a Sunday afternoon. Now, that was great for me.
Yeah.
I lived here just down the road. Previous wife, a posh house, 4 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. I was much richer then.
And you had your extra £10 a month by then.
Oh, I had that. I mean, that was, yeah, and I had a stag, and life was great. And I was down to fly one Sunday afternoon, and Trub, as a co-pilot, and Trub came in and pinched the flight off me.
Yeah.
Just because, quite naturally, he wanted to fly.
Yeah.
I mean, Trub was the same as all of us, really, in that regard. And I'm not going to knock him for that.
No. The passion of the aeroplanes.
And so I lost my co-pilot's flight on a Sunday afternoon because the boss wanted to fly.
Yeah.
Why should he not?
Yeah.
But
I retired with 18,000 hours and 3 years on the Concorde fleet.
Well done.
One thing I've so enjoyed this chat so far today was the fact we've got that in common. We both had the incredible privilege of flying Concorde. As I started an hour ago by saying, you were there at the beginning, and I
wasn't, son.
Well, nearly,
I was there 4 years after the beginning.
But close, compared to me.
Close.
And I was
certainly
there close to the end. And
exactly.
What a great privilege
I agree. I concur heartily. I heartily concur. To answer your question specifically, I think I have about Delta Golf's the Concorde I've flown the most, and I think I have about 130 to 140 hours on it.
Yeah.
And YD sitting behind it, I have 800 hours on YD.
Okay.
On YD. The 111. Just to put it in perspective.
Sitting behind Concorde at Brooklands.
Absolutely.
And the team at Brooklands do a fantastic job looking after Delta Golf.
Oh, they do.
It's
a
repainted
dream.
it last year.
Yeah.
And it looks really good. They do photo shoots around it.
I know they do.
And the interest in Concorde now it hasn't dwindled at all. It's greater
Well, I'm
than
delighted
ever.
to hear that because it generates. I mean, Brooklands needs money. All museums need money, and Delta Golf must be a real money spinner.
It really is.
Must be.
I was there during the February half term that we've just had, and the Concorde Experience tours were running every 15 minutes.
How about that?
And they were sold out.
That's
they
wonderful.
Were sold out. And it's wonderful to see youngsters, young school children looking up at Concorde as if she's something from the future. And we all know that she's something from the past.
Yeah. It still cuts the mustard, doesn't it?
It really
I mean, you can't fault the lines.
When she first flew, we'd only just got colour television. Yes. And that was on BBC Two.
How about that? Yes.
Alan, we'll stop there.
Okay.
We may come back and do some more, but I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to thank you so much for... I could talk to you all day.
We could talk all day. We're kindred spirits.
Yeah, I know.
So, now, gents, can I offer you a little refreshment?